One of the most essential skills for any woodworker is the ability to build a simple wooden box. Box building is an excellent opportunity to brush up on your woodworking skills or practice new techniques or with new materials that you haven't used before. Today we're going to be building a stunning keepsake box, and I'm going to give you all of my best advice and tips along the way, from wood selection to design details and how to get an absolutely amazing finish that's going to stop everyone in their tracks. So when it comes to materials for our box, since we're working on such a small scale, this is an excellent time to use either some exotics or some highly figured wood. For one, because this is such a small box, we don't need a lot of material. So instead of going out and spending hundreds of dollars on a bunch of material, a couple of small pieces is enough to build our box. But because this is such a small project and a relatively simple design, we want to use the materials to speak volumes here and really bring the attention and the wow factor. And that's why I decided to go with a figured maple for this keepsake box. And I don't need a lot of material for this. In fact, this board is more than enough for the box that I'm going to do today. So I'm probably going to save some of this for a smaller box down the road. And the figure on this board is absolutely amazing. I can't wait to see what this is going to look like with the finish on it, but we'll get to that much later. For now, this board is pretty thin. It's about a ½ inch, but it's still too thick for the box that we want to make. It's very important that we keep things into proper proportions. In a very small box like this, ½ inch is just too thick. So I'm going to mill this down and get it down to about 3/8, which should be about perfect for the size of the box we're building. So now we need to establish the dimensions of our box. This is going to be very important because throughout this build, I'm going to be taking advantage of something called the golden ratio, which is derived from the Fibonacci sequence. Now, don't get worried about this. You don't need to know anything about the equations or the mathematics or how any of this is derived. I've already done all the figures for you, and I'm going to list all the dimensions. They'll be in the plans that you can get at my website. Just for now, I'm going to establish the sides of the box, which the long side is going to be 8 inches, and that means that the short side following the sequence is going to be right around 5 inches. So we'll cut this board down to get our sides for our box. Now it's extremely important that we make sure that our cuts are perfectly square and the exact same size for the sides of our box. So for that, I'm going to be using my crosscut sled and a good stop block to cut all the parts out. All right, now we've got our sides cut to length. We need to establish how tall our box is going to be. Now, this is where using the golden ratio or Fibonacci sequence is going to help us establish the perfect proportions that are going to look best to the eye. So if our long sides are 8 inches and our short sides are 5 inches, if we follow the sequence, the next number for the height is going to be just over 3 inches tall. Now I'm going to add an extra 1/8 of an inch on top of that, which is the width of my blade curve, and you'll see why in a few minutes. All right, so now we need to make some miters on the end of our boards. Now to do this, I'm going to set my blade to 45 degrees, and I'm going to use my miter gauge and a stop block to cut the miters. Now I want to take off as little material as possible to preserve as much length of our boards as we can. So you want to cut right up to the edge and not take any more if at all possible. All right, so now I'm bringing the parts over here to our shooting board where I'm going to clean up the miters. Now on a large piece of furniture, it really doesn't matter that much. You don't have to go through this extra step, because any small inconsistency with your miters, even tiny gaps, just aren't going to be that noticeable. But on something this small and intricate, even tiny gaps are really going to stand out. So using the shooting board, really clean up and true up these miter joints so that we don't have any gaps or any flaws with them, and it's just going to make everything look nice and clean and tight. Try to make sure that you're taking about the same number of passes on each joint, and that's going to make sure that you're taking the same amount of material off so that you don't get your sides inconsistent and have different sizes. All right, so now that we got our miters cleaned up, the next thing we need to do is cut the grooves for our top and bottom panels, and we'll take care of that over at the table saw. To cut the grooves, first I need to change out my table saw blade. Now I'm putting in a blade with a flat ground tooth so that I get a nice flat bottom when I cut the grooves. Then I'm going to use some setup blocks to establish the blade height and the distance from the fence. Now, of course, if you don't have a set of setup blocks, you can just measure using a ruler. But having something like this makes it a lot faster and easier to set up your tools. Go ahead and cut your grooves into all 4 pieces on the top and the bottom. Once you've got all of the grooves cut, bump the fence over a little bit, make the cut again, widening out the groove. Now check the size of the groove with the panel that you're going to be using. Keep adjusting the fence until you get a nice snug fit. Once you've got that perfect fit, finish cutting the rest of the grooves. I'm going to be making the top and bottom panels of my box out of wingy. And as I said before, a small box like this is an excellent opportunity to play with some more exotic materials. But there's a very specific reason why I chose this material for this box. You see, in this design, I'm playing very heavily with contrasting materials. And it's pretty obvious that this dark chocolate brown, almost black wingy is a very stark contrast to the very light colored figured maple. But did you notice the other contrast here? Let's take another look. You see, I've specifically chose the straightest grain I could find in this wingy. Now this is another very stark contrast to the wavy patterns and the curl in this maple. Now this is something I'd like you to start considering in your own designs and your own projects. Make sure you're not just considering the color of the materials that you're working with, but also consider the grain patterns and how they're going to flow from one part of the project to the next and how it's going to look in the overall design. And even though it sounds kind of cliche, I guess, whenever you start incorporating these types of elements into your projects, it's going to set your projects up to the next level, and it's really going to help accelerate your growth as a woodworker and a designer. When you're cutting out the panels, make sure you cut them slightly undersized to allow for just a little bit of wood movement. About 1/16 of an inch should be plenty. Then make sure to do a dry assembly just to make sure everything's fitting up properly. Before we do the actual glue up, we want to go ahead and sand the inside of all of our components while they're easy to get to. Because once it's glued together, it's going to be really hard to properly sand the inside of the box. Now this wingy has a couple of these little holes in it. I want to take care of those real quick. So they go all the way through. So a little bit of painter's tape on the back side. I'm going to use this Star Bond medium thick and dark brown, and just fill those holes so they're not as noticeable. A little dab will do you. All right, so now it's actually time to glue up our box, and I'm using some blue tape instead of clamps. I mean, this really is the simplest and easiest way that I've come across to glue up a small box like this, because you don't have to fiddle around with a bunch of clamps and try to get them into the right positions and over tightening anything, because the tape here itself acts as the clamp and keeps everything in line and holds it together long enough for the glue to dry. You just line up your parts and stretch some tape across each of the joints, then flip the whole thing over, add your glue to the miters, and fold it all together to form your box. In doing this, we don't need to add any glue to the inside to hold the panels in place, just let them float. All right, at this point, everything should be nice and square, but it doesn't hurt to just go ahead and just double check to make sure you don't need to make any final adjustments. And if everything's looking good, just give it some time and let the glue dry. So I'm gonna go grab some lunch and come back finish this in a bit. All right, so after grabbing some grub, we've got a box. Although it's kind of tough to get into right now. What are you doing? All right, so hear me out. I've been watching this guy, Bourbon Moth, and learned a really neat trick to getting in a box. Hey, what do you say? Hey, you just hang on there, Gallagher. There's a very simple way to open this box and make a lid at the same time. Over at the table saw, I'll set my blade height just shy of cutting all the way through the sides of the box. Then I'll set my distance between the fence and the blade so that I don't cut into my panel and I keep it encapsulated in the lid. Now I'll use a handsaw to carefully remove the lid from the box by cutting through the remaining material. There we go, and now we have a box with an actual lid that can come on and off. Now we just need to clean up this little bit of material that's left and we'll be ready for the next step. All right, so once I have the bulk of this excess material removed with my block plane, I'm going to get a sheet of sandpaper and just set the box on the sandpaper and kind of move it around and get the rest of it all even and smooth all the way around this lip. And now we have a box with a removable lid without having to resort to more deconstructive methods. All right, so the next thing this box needs is a liner on the inside. That's going to do a couple of things for us. For one, it's going to finish out the inside of this box so that we've got all wingy inside the box here, make it look nice and finished. Two, it's going to give this lid something to register on so that it doesn't just slide around and slide off the box. We've got some more wingy and let's make a liner. All right, so next I'm going to show you how we can get an absolutely killer finish on this heavily figured maple. But first we got to do some finish prep, and that means we got to do some sanding. So I'm going to sand everything up to about 220 to make sure that this box is just baby butt smooth, and make sure we round all the corners so there's no sharp edges anywhere, and then we'll get into some of the tricks that I'll show you to get the perfect finish. All right, let's make some magic happen with this finish. So I want to really accentuate the figure in this maple. To do that, I'm going to use a concentrated dye solution. Now, dye works very differently than stain. Where stain will just sit on the surface and color the wood, a dye is going to penetrate deep into the wood grain and into the figure itself. So we're going to use that to our advantage and really highlight the curl that's in this maple. To make this solution, I need a little bit of denatured alcohol and about 8 to 10 drops of our dye. Just apply the dye to the box with a foam brush, and don't worry about getting it on the wingay. The wingay is already pretty dark. It's not really going to show up, so it's not going to matter if you get any on it. Just make sure that you cover all of the maple evenly. Now again, this isn't really a stain, so we're not really coloring the box brown or anything. This is just going to soak into the wood grain, and it'll be a much lighter once it dries from what it is right now when it's going on. You can already see it's starting to bring out some of that figure. All right, with the dye applied to the box and the lid, we're just going to let this dye dry for a while, give it about an hour or two, and make sure it's completely dry before we go to the next step. All right, so now the dye's had a couple of hours to dry, we can move on to the next step. And as you can see, it's kind of a brown mess at the moment, but don't worry, don't panic. This is just kind of a ugly duckling phase of the process that we have to go through to get where we want to be with this finish. Yep, that looks like it. So what we need to do now is just remove the dye that's dried on the surface and left this kind of muddy mess that we see, and that's going to reveal what has happened beneath. All that really means is we're just going to do a bit more sanding until it looks like all the dye is gone. All right, so we got our box sanded down and all the dye removed from the surface, so we're looking much better now. I'm sure some of you are asking, why did we do all that to begin with? You put the dye on and then you sanded it all away. Well, we sanded away what was on the surface, but that dye really soaked down into this wood grain and the figure in this maple. And when we put the finish on, it's really going to pop because that dye is really going to stand out when we put the oil finish on. Now for the finish, I'm going to be using Osmo, which is a hard wax oil. Now out of all the different ones that I've tried, Osmo looks the best on maple. It doesn't add that amber yellow tone that you get with a lot of oil finishes. All right, now I've been promising some magic with this finish, so here we go. Look at how that grain, that figure comes alive with that Osmo. That looks amazing. Really happy with how that's looking. Now when I'm applying this kind of finish, I like to use these white Brillo pads. They give just enough scrub where you can really get the finish down into the grain, but it's not going to cause any scratches or anything in the wood. Just make sure you're getting this down into all the little corners and then all this grain. You want to go pretty light. You don't need a heavy coat. A little bit of this stuff will go a long ways. You can see how much it darkens up that wingy without finish with the finish. All right, once we've got all the finish on and let it sit for just a minute, you want to come back and wipe away all the excess. You don't want any standing finish on the box. This is not going to dry properly. So you want to wipe it away until it feels like it's completely dry. All right, so a couple of coats of Osmo later and our keepsake box is done. And this thing looks absolutely gorgeous. I just love the way this figure came out, and that dye really helped bring that to life. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please make sure and subscribe and check out some of my other videos where I have plenty of other woodworking projects. Also, if you want some plans for a box like this or any of my other projects, I have those at biscuittreewoodworks.com. Until then, go build something awesome.